Part 3, Chapter 9 of Saints' Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 9. She was awakened by the scream of an engine, and looked round her, amazed. Her neck had fallen sideways while she slept, and felt horribly stiff. Her head ached, and she was shivering. She saw by the clock that it was past 5. If only I could get some tea, she thought. Anyway, I won't stay here any longer. When she had washed and rubbed some of the stiffness out of her neck, the tea renewed her sense of adventure wonderfully. Her train did not start for an hour. She had time for a walk, to warm herself, and went down to the river. There was an early haze, and all looked a little mysterious, but people were already passing on their way to work. She walked along, looking at the water flowing up under the bright mist, to which the gulls gave a sort of hovering life. She went as far as Blackfriars Bridge, and turned back, sat down on a bench under a plane tree, just as the sun broke through. A little pasty woman with a pinched, yellowish face was already sitting there, so still and seeming to see so little that Noel wondered of what she could be thinking. While she watched, the woman's face began puckering, and tears rolled slowly down, trickling from pucker to pucker, till, summoning up her courage, Noel sidled nearer and said, "Oh, what's the matter?" The tears seemed to stop from sheer surprise. Little grey eyes gazed round, patient little eyes from above an almost bridgeless nose. "I had a baby. It's dead. Its father's dead in France. I was going in the water. I didn't like the look of it. Now I never will." The "now I never will" moved Noel terribly. She slid her arm along the back of the bench and clasped the skinniest of shoulders. "Don't cry. It's my first. I'm 38. I'll never have another. Oh, why didn't I go in the water?" The face puckered again, and the squeezed-out tears ran down. "Of course you must cry," thought Noel. "Cry and cry till it feels better." And she stroked the shoulder of the little woman, whose emotion was disengaging the scent of old clothes. "The father of my baby was killed in France too," she said at last. The little sad grey eyes looked curiously around. "Was he? Have you got your baby still?" "Yes. Oh, yes." "Glad of that. Hurts so bad it does. I'd rather lose me husband than me baby any day." The sun was shining now on a cheek of that terribly patient face. Its brightness seemed cruel, perching there. "Can I do anything to help you?" Noel murmured. "No, thank you, miss. I'm going home now. I don't live far. Thank you kindly." And raising her eyes for one more of those half-bewildered looks, she moved away along the embankment wall. When she was out of sight, Noel walked back to the station. The train was in, and she took her seat. She had 3 fellow passengers, all in khaki, very silent and moody as men are when they have to get up early. One was tall, dark, and perhaps 35. The second small and about 50, with cropped, scanty grey hair. The third was of medium height and quite 65, with a long row of little coloured patches on his tunic, and a bald, narrow, well-shaped head, grey hair brushed back at the sides, and the thin, collected features and drooping moustache of the old school. It was at him that Noel looked. When he glanced out of the window, or otherwise retired within himself, she liked his face, but when he turned to the ticket collector or spoke to the others, she did not like it half so much. It was as if the old fellow had 2 selves, one of which he used when alone, the other in which he dressed every morning to meet the world. They began to talk about some tribunal on which they had to sit. Noel did not listen, but a word or two carried to her now and then. "How many today?" she heard the old fellow ask, and the little cropped man answered, 114. Fresh from the sight of the poor little shabby woman and her grief, she could not help a sort of shrinking from that trim old soldier with his thin, regular face, who held the fate of 114 in his firm, narrow grasp, perhaps every day. Would he understand their troubles or wants? Of course he wouldn't. Then she saw him looking at her critically with his keen eyes. If he had known her secret, he would be thinking, "A lady, and act like that? Oh, no, quite out of the question." And she felt as if she could sink under the seat with shame. But no doubt he was only thinking, "Very young to be travelling by herself at this hour of the morning. Pretty, too." If he knew the real truth of her, how he would stare. But why should this utter stranger, this old disciplinarian, by a casual glance, by the mere form of his face, make her feel more guilty and ashamed than she had yet felt? That puzzled her. He must be, a narrow, conventional old man. But he had this power to make her feel ashamed, because she felt that he had faith in his gods and was true to them, because she knew he would die sooner than depart from his creed of conduct. She turned to the window, biting her lips, angry and despairing. She would never get used to her position. It was no good. And again she had the longing of her dream to tuck her face away into that coat, smell the scent of the frieze, snuggle in, be protected, and forget. If I had been that poor, lonely little woman, she thought, and had lost everything, I should have gone into the water. I should have rushed and jumped. It's only luck that I'm alive. I won't look at that old man again, then I shan't feel so bad. She bought some chocolate at the station and nibbled it, gazing steadily at the fields covered with daisies and the first of the buttercups and cowslips. The three soldiers were talking now in carefully lowered voices. The words, "women," "under control," "perfect plague," came to her, making her ears burn in the hypersensitive mood caused by the strain of yesterday, her broken night, and the emotional meeting with the little woman. She felt as if they were including her among these women. If we stop, I'll get out, she thought. But when the train did stop, it was they who got out. She felt the old general's keen, veiled glance sum her up for the last time, and looked full at him just for a moment. He touched his cap and said, "Will you have the window up or down?" and lingered to draw it halfway up. His punctiliousness made her feel worse than ever. When the train had started again, she roamed up and down her empty carriage. There was no more a way out of her position than out of this rolling, cushioned carriage. And then she seemed to hear Fort's voice saying, "Sit down, please," and to feel his fingers clasp her wrist. Oh, he was nice and comforting. He would never reproach or remind her. And now, probably, she would never see him again. The train drew up at last. She did not know where George lodged and would have to go to his hospital. She planned to get there at 9:30, and having eaten a sort of breakfast at the station, went forth into the town. The seaside was still wrapped in the early glamour which haunts Chalk of a bright morning, but the streets were very much alive. Here was real business of the war. She passed houses which had been wrecked. Trucks clanged and shunted, great lorries rumbled smoothly by. Sea and air planes were moving like great birds far up in the bright haze, and khaki was everywhere. But it was the sea Noel wanted. She made her way westward to a little beach, and sitting down on a stone, opened her arms to catch the sun on her face and chest. The tide was nearly up, with the wavelets of a blue, bright sea. The greatest fact in the world, except the sun, vast and free, making everything human seem small and transitory. It did her good like a tranquilizing friend. The sea might be cruel and terrible, awful things it could do, and awful things were being done on it, but its wide level line, its never-ending song, its sane savour, were the best medicine she could possibly have taken. She rubbed the shelly sand between her fingers in absurd ecstasy, took off her shoes and stockings, paddled, and sat drying her legs in the sun. When she left the little beach, she felt as if someone had said to her, "Your troubles are very little. There's the sun, the sea, the air. Enjoy them. They can't take those from you." At the hospital she had to wait half an hour in a little bare room before George came. "Ollie, splendid. I've got an hour. Let's get out of this cemetery. We'll have time for a good stretch on the tops. Jolly of you to come to me. Tell us all about it." When she finished, he squeezed her arm. "I knew it wouldn't do. Your dad forgot that he's a public figure and must expect to be damned accordingly. But though you've cut and run, he'll resign all the same, Nolly." "Oh, no," cried Noel. George shook his head. "Yes, he'll resign, you see. He's got no worldly sense, not a grain." "Then I shall have spoiled his life just as if— Oh, no." "Let's sit down here. I must be back at 11. They sat down on a bench where the green cliffs stretched out before them, over a sea quite clear of haze, far down and very blue. Why should he resign? Cried Noel again. Now that I've gone, he'll be lost without it all. George smiled. Found, my dear. He'll be where he ought to be, Nolly, where the church is, and the churchmen are not. In the air. Don't, cried Noel passionately. No, I'm not chaffing. There's no room on earth for saints in authority. There's use for a saintly symbol, even if one doesn't hold with it. But there's no mortal use for those who try to have things both ways, to be saints and seers of visions, and yet to come the practical and worldly and rule ordinary men's lives. Saintly example, yes, but not saintly governance. You've been his deliverance, Norrie. But Daddy loves his church. George frowned. Of course it'll be a wrench. A man's bound to have a cosy feeling about a place where he's been boss so long. And there's something about a church. The drone, the scent, the half-darkness. There's beauty in it. It's a pleasant drug. But he's not been asked to give up the drug habit, only to stop administering drugs to others. Don't worry, Noddy. I don't believe that's ever suited him. He wants a thicker skin than he's got. But all the people he helps. No reason he shouldn't go on helping people, is there? But to go on living there without... Mother died there, you know. George grunted. Dreams, Noddy, all round him, of the past and the future, of what people are and what he can do with them. I never see him without a skirmish, as you know, and yet I'm fond of him. But I should be twice as fond and half as likely to skirmish if he dropped the habits of authority. Then I believe he'd have some real influence over me. There's something beautiful about him. I know that quite well. Yes, murmured Noel fervently. He's such a queer mixture, mused George. Clean out of his age. Chalks above most of the parsons in a spiritual sense, and chalks below most of them in the worldly. Yet I believe he's in the right of it. The church ought to be a forlorn hope, Nolly. Then we should believe in it. Instead of that, it's a sort of business that no one can take too seriously. You see, the church spiritual can't make good in this age, has no chance of making good, and so in the main it's given it up for vested interests and social influence. Your father is a symbol of what the church is not. But what about you, my dear? There's a room at my boarding-house, and only one old lady besides myself who knits all the time. If Grace can get shifted, we'll find a house, and you can have the baby. They'll send your luggage on from Paddington if you write, and in the meantime Gracie's got some things here that you can have. I'll have to send a wire to Daddy. I'll do that. You come to my diggings at 1:30, and I'll settle you in. Till then, you'd better stay up here. When he'd gone, she roamed a little farther, and lay down on the short grass where the chalk broke through in patches. She could hear a distant rumbling, very low, travelling in that grass, the long mutter of the Flanders guns. I wonder if it's as beautiful a day there, she thought. How dreadful to see no green, no butterflies, no flowers, not even sky for the dust of the shells. Oh, won't it ever, ever end? And a sort of passion for the earth welled up in her, the warm grassy earth along which she lay, pressed so close that she could feel it with every inch of her body, and the soft spikes of the grass against her nose and lips. An aching sweetness tortured her. She wanted the earth to close its arms about her. She wanted the answer to her embrace of it. She was alive and wanted love, not death, not loneliness, not death. And out there, where the guns muttered, millions of men would be thinking that same thought. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Part 3, Chapter 10 of Saints' Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 10. Pierson had passed nearly the whole night with the relics of his past, the records of his stewardship, the tokens of his short married life. The idea which had possessed him walking home in the moonlight sustained him in that melancholy task of docketing and destruction. There was not nearly so much to do as one would have supposed, for with all his dreaminess he had been oddly neat and businesslike in all parish matters. But 100 times that night he stopped, overcome by memories. Every corner, drawer, photograph, paper was a thread in the long-spun web of his life in this house. Some phase of his work, some vision of his wife or daughters started forth from each bit of furniture, picture, doorway. Noiseless, in his slippers, he stole up and down between the study, dining-room, drawing-room, and anyone seeing him at his work in the dim light which visited the staircase from above the front door and the upper passage window would have thought, a ghost gone into mourning for the condition of the world. He had to make this reckoning tonight, while the exaltation of his new idea was on him, had to rummage out the very depths of old association, so that once for all he might know whether he had strength to close the door on the past. 5 o'clock struck before he had finished, and almost dropping from fatigue, sat down at his little piano in bright daylight. The last memory to beset him was the first of all, his honeymoon, before they came back to live in this house, already chosen, furnished, and waiting for them. They had spent it in Germany, the first days in Baden-Baden, and each morning had been awakened by a chorale played down in the gardens of the Kurhaus, a gentle, beautiful tune, to remind them that they were in heaven. And softly, so softly that the tunes seemed to be but dreams, he began playing those old chorales, one after another, so that the stilly sounds floated out through the opened window, puzzling the early birds and cats and those few humans who were abroad as yet. He received the telegram from Noel in the afternoon of the same day, just as he was about to set out for Lila's to get news of her, and close on the top of it came Lavandie. He found the painter standing disconsolate in front of his picture. "Mademoiselle has deserted me." "I'm afraid we shall all desert you soon, monsieur." "You are going?" "Yes, I am leaving here. I hope to go to France." "And mademoiselle?" "She is at the sea with my son-in-law." The painter ran his hands through his hair, but stopped them halfway, as if aware that he was being guilty of ill-breeding. "Mon Dieu," he said, "is this not a calamity for you, monsieur le curé?" But his sense of the calamity was so patently limited to his unfinished picture that Pierson could not help a smile. "Ah, monsieur," said the painter, on whom nothing was lost, "comme je suis égoïste, I show my feelings. It is deplorable. My disappointment must seem a bagatelle to you, who will be so distressed at leaving your old home. This must be a time of great trouble. Believe me, I understand. But to sympathize with a grief which is not shown would be an impertinence, would it not? You English gentlefolk do not let us share your griefs. You keep them to yourselves." Pierson stared. "True," he said. "Quite true." "I am no judge of Christianity, monsieur. But for us artists, the doors of the human heart stand open, our own and others. I suppose we have no pride. C'est très indélicat. Tell me, monsieur, you would not think it worthy of you to speak to me of your troubles, would you, as I have spoken of mine?" Pierson bowed his head, abashed. "You preach of universal charity and love," went on Lavandie, "but how can there be that when you teach also secretly the keeping of your troubles to yourselves? Man responds to example, not to teaching. You set the example of the stranger, not the brother. You expect from others what you do not give. Frankly, monsieur, do you not feel that with every elevation of your soul and feelings, virtue goes out of you? And I will tell you why, if you will not think it an offence. In opening your hearts, you feel that you lose authority. You are officers and must never forget that. Is it not so?" Pierson grew red. "I hope there is another feeling, too. I think we feel that to speak of our sufferings or deeper feelings is to obtrude oneself, to make a fuss, to be self-concerned, when we might be concerned with others." "Monsieur, au fond, we are all concerned with self. To seem selfless is but your particular way of cultivating the perfection of self. You admit that not to obtrude self is the way to perfect yourself. Eh bien, what is that but a deeper concern with self? To be free of this, there is no way but to forget all about oneself and what one is doing, as I forget everything when I am painting. But," he added with a sudden smile, "you would not wish to forget the perfecting of self. It would not be right in your profession. So I must take away this picture, must I not? It is one of my best works. I regret much not to have finished it." "Some day, perhaps." "Some day. The picture will stand still, but mademoiselle will not. She will rush at something, and behold, this face will be gone. No, I prefer to keep it as it is. It has truth now." And, lifting down the canvas, he stood it against the wall and folded up the easel. Bonsoir, monsieur. You have been very good to me. He wrung Pierson's hand, and his face for a moment seemed all eyes and spirit. Adieu. Goodbye, Pierson murmured. God bless you. I don't know if I have great confidence in him, replied Lavendy, but I shall ever remember that so good a man as you has wished it. To mademoiselle my distinguished salutations, if you please. If you will permit me, I will come back for my other things tomorrow. And, carrying easel and canvas, he departed. Pierson stayed in the old drawing-room, waiting for Gratian to come in, and thinking over the painter's words. Had his education and position really made it impossible for him to be brotherly? Was this the secret of the impotence which he sometimes felt, the reason why charity and love were not more alive in the hearts of his congregation? God knows I have no consciousness of having felt myself superior, he thought, and yet I would be truly ashamed to tell people of my troubles and of my struggles. Can it be that Christ, if he were on earth, would count us Pharisees, believing ourselves not as other men? But surely it is not as Christians, but rather as gentlemen that we keep ourselves to ourselves. Officers, he called us. I fear it is true. Ah, well, there would not be many more days now. He would learn out there how to open the hearts of others, and his own. Suffering and death levelled all barriers, made all men brothers. He was still sitting there when Gratian came in, and taking her hand, he said, Noel has gone down to George, and I want you to get transferred and go to them, Gracie. I'm giving up the parish and asking for a chaplaincy. Giving up, after all this time? Is it because of Nolly? No, I think not. I think the time has come. I feel my work here is barren. Oh, no, and even if it is, it's only because— Pierson smiled. Because of what, Gracie? Dad, it's what I've felt in myself. We want to think and decide things for ourselves. We want to own our own consciences. We can't take things at second hand any longer. Pierson's face darkened. Ah, he said, to have lost faith is a grievous thing. We're gaining charity, cried Gratian. The two things are not opposed, my dear. Oh, not in theory, but in practice I think they often are. Oh, Dad, you look so tired. Have you really made up your mind? Won't you feel lost? For a little. I shall find myself out there. But the look on his face was too much for Gratian's composure, and she turned away. Pierson went down to his study to write his letter of resignation. Sitting before that blank sheet of paper, he realized to the full how strongly he had resented the public condemnation passed on his own flesh and blood, how much his action was the expression of a purely mundane championship of his daughter, of a mundane mortification. Pride, he thought. Ought I to stay and conquer it? Twice he set his pen down. Twice took it up again. He could not conquer it. To stay where he was, not wanted, on a sort of sufferance? Never. And while he sat before that empty sheet of paper, he tried to do the hardest thing a man can do, to see himself as others see him, and met with such success as one might expect, harking at once to the verdicts, not of others at all, but of his own conscience, and coming soon to that perpetual gnawing sense which had possessed him ever since the war began, that it was his duty to be dead. This feeling that to be alive was unworthy of him when so many of his flock had made the last sacrifice was reinforced by his domestic tragedy and the bitter disillusionment it had brought. A sense of having lost caste weighed on him while he sat there with his past receding from him, dusty and unreal. He had the queeriest feeling of his old life falling from him, dropping round his feet like the outworn scales of a serpent, rung after rung of tasks and duties performed day after day, year after year. Had they ever been quite real? Well, he had shed them now, and was to move out into life, illumined by the great reality, death. And, taking up his pen, he wrote his resignation. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Part 3, Chapter 11 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 11. 1. The last Sunday, sunny and bright. Though he did not ask her to go, Gresham went to every service that day, and the sight of her, after this long interval, in their old pew, where once he had been wont to see his wife's face, and draw refreshment therefrom, affected Pierson more than anything else. He told no one of his coming departure, shrinking from the falsity and suppression which must underlie every allusion and expression of regret. In the last minute of his last sermon he would tell them. He went through the day in a sort of dream. Truly proud and sensitive under this social blight, he shrank from all alike, made no attempt to single out supporters or adherents from those who had fallen away. He knew there would be some, perhaps many, seriously grieved that he was going, but to try and realize who they were, to weigh them in the scales against the rest and so forth, was quite against his nature. It was all or nothing. But when for the last time of all those hundreds he mounted the steps of his dark pulpit, he showed no trace of finality, did not perhaps even feel it yet. For so beautiful a summer evening the congregation was large. In spite of all reticence, rumour was busy, and curiosity still rife. The writers of the letters, anonymous and otherwise, had spent a week, not indeed in proclaiming what they had done, but in justifying to themselves the secret fact that they had done it. And this was best achieved by speaking to their neighbours of the serious and awkward situation of the poor vicar. The result was visible in a better attendance than there had been since summer-time began. Pierson had never been a great preacher. His voice lacked resonance and pliancy, his thought breadth and buoyancy, and he was not free from the sing-song which mars the utterance of many who have to speak professionally. But he always made an impression of goodness and sincerity. On this last Sunday evening he preached again the first sermon he had ever preached from that pulpit, fresh from the honeymoon with his young wife. Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. It lacked now the happy fervour of that most happy of all his days, yet gained poignancy, coming from so worn a face and a voice. Gresham, who knew that he was going to end with his farewell, was in a choke of emotion long before he came to it. She sat winking away her tears, and not till he paused for so long that she thought his strength had failed, did she look up. He was leaning a little forward, seeming to see nothing, but his hands, grasping the pulpit's edge, were quivering. There was deep silence in the church, for the look of his face and figure was strange, even to Gresham. When his lips parted again to speak, a mist covered her eyes, and she lost sight of him. "Friends, I am leaving you. These are the last words I shall ever speak in this place. I go to other work. You have been very good to me. God has been very good to me. I pray with all my whole heart that he may bless you all. Amen. Amen." The mist cleared into tears, and she could see him again gazing down at her. Was it at her? He was surely seeing something, some vision sweeter than reality, something he loved more dearly. She fell on her knees and buried her face in her hand. All through the hymn she knelt, and through his clear, slow benediction. "The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God, and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, be amongst you, and remain with you always." And still she knelt on, till she was alone in the church. Then she rose and stole home. He did not come in. She did not expect him. "It's over," she kept thinking. "All over. My beloved Daddy. Now he has no home. Nolly and I have pulled him down. And yet I couldn't help it. Perhaps she couldn't. Poor Nolly." 2. Pierson had stayed in the vestry, talking with his choir and wardens. There was no hitch, for his resignation had been accepted, and he had arranged with a friend to carry on till the new vicar was appointed. When they were gone, he went back into the empty church and mounted to the organ loft. A little window up there was open, and he stood leaning against the stone, looking out, resting his whole being. Only now that it was over did he know what stress he had been through. Sparrows were chirping, but sound of traffic had almost ceased in that quiet Sunday hour of the evening meal. Finished. Incredible that he would never come up here again, never see those roof lines, that corner of square garden, and hear this familiar chirping of the sparrows. He sat down at the organ and began to play. The last time the sound would roll out and echo round the emptied house of God. For a long time he played, while the building darkened slowly down there below him. Of all that he would leave, he would miss this most, the right to come and play here in the darkening church, to release emotional sound in this dim, empty space, growing ever more beautiful. From chord to chord, he let himself go deeper and deeper into the surge and swell of those sound waves, losing all sense of actuality, till the music and the whole dark building were fused in one rapturous solemnity. Away down there the darkness crept over the church, till the pews, the altar, all was invisible save the columns and the walls. He began playing his favourite slow movement from Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, kept to the end for the visions it ever brought him. And a cat, which had been stalking the sparrows, crept in through the little window, and crouched, startled, staring at him with her green eyes. He closed the organ, went quickly down, and locked up his church for the last time. It was warmer outside than in, and lighter, for daylight was not quite gone. He moved away a few yards and stood looking up. Walls, buttresses, and spire were clothed in milky, shadowy grey. The top of the spire seemed to touch a star. Goodbye, my church, he thought. Goodbye. Goodbye. He felt his face quiver, clenched his teeth, and turned away. End of Part 3, Chapter 11. Part 3, Chapter 12 of Saints' Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 12. When Noel fled, Fort had started forward to stop her. Then, realizing that with his lameness he could never catch her, he went back and entered Lila's bedroom. She had taken off her dress and was standing in front of her glass, with the cigarette still in her mouth, and the only movement was the curling of its blue smoke. He could see her face reflected, pale, with a little spot of red in each cheek, and burning red ears. She had not seemed to hear him coming in, but he saw her eyes change when they caught his reflection in the mirror. From lost and blank they became alive and smouldering. "Noel's gone," he said. She answered, as if to his reflection in the glass. "And you haven't gone too?" "Ah, no, of course. Your leg." "She fled, I suppose. It's rather a jar, my coming in, I'm afraid." "No, it was my coming in that was the jar." Lila turned round. "Jimmy, I wonder you could discuss me. The rest—" She shrugged her shoulders. "But that—" "I was not discussing you. I merely said you were not to be envied for having me. Are you?" The moment he had spoken he was sorry. The anger in her eyes changed instantly, first to searching, then to misery. She cried out, "I was to be envied. Oh, Jimmy, I was!" and flung herself face down on the bed. Through Fort's mind went the thought, atrocious. How could he soothe, make her feel that he loved her when he didn't, that he wanted her when he wanted Noel? He went up to the bedside and touched her timidly. "Lila, what is it? You're overtired. What's the matter? I couldn't help the child being here. Why'd you let it upset you? She's gone. It's all right. Things are just as they were." "Yes," came the strangled echo. "Just." He knelt down and stroked her arm. It shivered under the touch, seemed to stop shivering and wait for the next touch, as if hoping it might be warmer. Shivered again. "Look at me," he said. "What is it you want? I'm ready to do anything." She turned and drew herself up on the bed, screwing herself back against the pillow as if for support, with her knees drawn under her. He was astonished at the strength of her face and figure, thus entrenched. "My dear Jimmy," she said, "I want you to do nothing but get me another cigarette. At my age one expects no more than one gets." She held out her thumb and finger. "Do you mind?" Fort turned away to get the cigarette. With what bitter restraint and curious little smile she had said that. But no sooner was he out of the room and hunting blindly for the cigarettes than his mind was filled with an aching concern for Noel, fleeing like that, reckless and hurt, with nowhere to go. He found the polished birchwood box which held the cigarettes, and made a desperate effort to dismiss the image of the girl before he again reached Lila. She was still sitting there, with her arms crossed, in the stillness of one whose every nerve and fibre were stretched taut. "Have one yourself," she said. "The pipe of peace." Fort lit the cigarette and sat down on the edge of the bed, and his mind at once went back to Noel. "Yes," she said suddenly, "I wonder where she's gone. Can you see her? She might do something reckless a second time. Poor Jimmy, it would be a pity. And so that monk's been here and drunk champagne. Good idea. Get me some, Jimmy." Again Fort went, and with him the image of the girl. When he came back the second time, she put on that dark silk garment in which she had appeared suddenly radiant the fatal night after the Queen's Hall concert. She took the wine-glass and passed him, going into the sitting-room. "Come and sit down," she said. "Is your leg hurting you?" "Well, not more than usual." And he sat down beside her. "Won't you have some? In vino veritas, my friend?" He shook his head and said humbly, "I admire you, Lila." "That's lucky. I don't know anyone else who would." And she drank her champagne at a draught. "Don't you wish," she said suddenly, "that I'd been one of those wonderful new women, all brain and good works? How I should have talked the universe up and down, and the war, and causes, drinking tea and never boring you to try and love me. What a pity!" But to Fort there had come Noel's words. "It's awfully funny, isn't it?" "Lila," he said suddenly, "something's got to be done. So long as you don't wish me to, I'll promise never to see that child again." "My dear boy, she's not a child. She's ripe for love. And I'm too ripe for love. That's what's the matter, and I've got to lump it." She wrenched her hand out of his, and dropping the empty glass, covered her face. The awful sensation which visits the true Englishman when a scene stares him in the face spun in Fort's brain. Should he seize her hands, drag them down, and kiss her? Should he get up and leave her alone? Speak or keep silent? Try console? Try to pretend? And he did absolutely nothing. So far as a man can understand that moment in a woman's life when she accepts the defeat of youth and beauty, he understood perhaps, but it was only a glimmering. He understood much better how she was recognizing once for all that she loved where she was not loved. "And I can't help that," he thought dumbly. "Simply can't help that." Nothing he could say or do would alter it. No words can convince a woman when kisses have lost reality. Then, to his infinite relief, she took her hands from her face and said, "This is very dull. I think you'd better go, Jimmy." He made an effort to speak, but was too afraid of falsity in his voice. "Very nearly a scene," said Lila. "My God! How men hate them! So do I. I've had too many in my time. Nothing comes of them but a headache next morning. I spared you that, Jimmy. Give me a kiss for it." He bent down and put his lips to hers. With all his heart he tried to answer the passion in her kiss. She pushed him away suddenly and said faintly, "Thank you. You did try." Fort dashed his hand across his eyes. The sight of her face just then moved him horribly. What a brute he felt. He took her limp hand, put it to his lips, and murmured, "I shall come in tomorrow. We'll go to the theatre, shall we? Good night, Lila." But in opening the door he caught sight of her face, staring at him, evidently waiting for him to turn. The eyes had a frightened look. They went suddenly soft, so soft as to give his heart a squeeze. She lifted her hand, blew him a kiss, and he saw her smiling. Without knowing what his own lips answered, he went out. He could not make up his mind to go away, but crossing to the railings, stood leaning against them, looking up at her windows. She had been very good to him. He felt like a man who had won at cards and sneaked away without giving the loser his revenge. If only she hadn't loved him, and it had been a soulless companionship, a quite sordid business. Anything rather than this. English to the backbone, he could not divest himself of a sense of guilt. To see no way of making up to her, of straightening it out, made him feel intensely mean. "Shall I go up again?" he thought. The window curtain moved. Then the shreds of light up there vanished. "She's gone to bed," he thought. "I should only upset her worse. Where is Noel now, I wonder? I shall never see her again, I suppose. Altogether a bad business. My God, yes, a bad, bad business." and, painfully, for his leg was hurting him, he walked away. Lila was only too well aware of a truth that feelings are no less real, poignant, and important to those outside morality's ring fence than to those within. Her feelings were, indeed, probably even more real and poignant, just as a wild fruit's flavour is sharper than that of the tame product. Opinion, she knew, would say that having wilfully chosen a position outside morality, she had not half the case for broken-heartedness she should have if Fort had been her husband. Opinion, she knew, would say she had no claim on him, and the sooner an illegal tie was broken, the better. But she felt fully as wretched as if she had been married. She had not wanted to be outside morality, never in her life wanted to be that. She was like those who by confession shed their sins and start again with a clear conscience. She never meant to sin, only to love, and when she was in love, nothing else mattered for the moment. But though a gambler, she had always so far paid up. Only this time the stakes were the heaviest a woman can put down. It was her last throw, and she knew it. So long as a woman believed in her attraction, there was hope, even when the curtain fell on a love affair. But for Lila the lamp of belief had suddenly gone out, and when this next curtain dropped, she felt that she must sit in the dark until old age made her indifferent. And between 44 and real old age a gulf is fixed. This was the first time a man had tired of her. Why? He'd only been tired before he began, or so she felt. In one swift moment, as of a drowning person, she saw again all the passages of their companionship, knew with certainty that it had never been a genuine flame. Shame ran consuming in her veins. She buried her face in the cushions. This girl had possessed his real heart all the time. With a laugh, she thought, I put my money on the wrong horse. I ought to have backed Edward. I could have turned that poor monk's head. If only I'd never seen Jimmy again, if I'd torn his letter up, I could have made poor Edward love me. Ives, what folly! Things happened as they must. And, starting up, she began to roam the little room. Without Jimmy she would be wretched. With him she would be wretched too. I can't bear to see his face, she thought, and I can't live here without him. It's really funny. The thought of her hospital filled her with loathing. To go there day after day with this despair eating at her heart, she simply could not. She went over her resources. She had more money than she thought. Jimmy had given her a Christmas present of £500. She wanted to tear up the cheque or force him to take it back, but the realities of the previous 5 years had prevailed with her, and she had banked it. She was glad now. She had not to consider money. Her mind sought to escape in the past. She thought of her first husband, Ronnie Fane, of their mosquito-curtained rooms in that ghastly Madras heat. Poor Ronnie! What a pale, cynical young ghost started up under that name. She thought of Lynch, his horsey matter-of-fact solidity. She had loved them both, for a time. She thought of the veldt of Constantia and the loom of Table Mountain under the stars, and the first sight of Jimmy, his straight look, the curve of his crisp head, the kind, fighting schoolboy frankness of his face. Even now, after all those months of their companionship, that long-ago evening at grape-harvest, when she sang to him under the scented creepers, was the memory of him most charged with real feeling. That one evening, at any rate, he had longed for her, 11 years ago, when she was in her prime. She could have held her own then, nor would have come in vain. To think that this girl had still 15 years before she would be even in her prime. 15 years of witchery, and then another 10 before she was on the shelf. Why, if Noel married Jimmy, he would be an old man doting on her still by the time she had reached this fatal age of 44. She felt as if she must scream, and stuffing her handkerchief into her mouth, turned out the light. Darkness cooled her a little. She pulled aside the curtains and let in the moonlight. Jimmy and that girl were out in it somewhere, seeking each other, if not in body, then in thought. And soon, somehow, somewhere, they would come together. Come together because fate meant them to. Fate, which had given her young cousin a likeness to herself, placed her two in just such a hopeless position as appealed to Jimmy, and gave him a chance against younger men. She saw it with bitter surety. good gamblers cut their losses. Yes, and proud women did not keep unwilling lovers. If she'd even an outside chance, she would trail her pride, drag it through the mud, through thorns. But she had not. And she clenched her fist and struck out at the night as though at the face of that fate which one could never reach, impalpable, remorseless, surrounding fate with its faint, mocking smile, devoid of all human warmth. Nothing could set back the clock and give her what this girl had. Time had done her in, as it did in every woman, one by one. And she saw herself going down the years, powdering a little more, painting a little more, touching up her hair, till it was all artifice, holding on by every little device. And all to what end? To see his face get colder and colder, hear his voice more and more constrained to gentleness, and know that underneath aversion was growing with the thought, "You are keeping me from life and love," till one evening, in sheer nerve break, she would say or do some fearful thing, and he would come no more. "No, Jimmy," she thought, "find her and stay with her. You're not worth all that." And puffing to the curtains as though with that gesture she could shut out her creeping fate, she turned up the light and sat down at her writing-table. She stayed some minutes motionless, her chin resting on her hands, the dark silk fallen down from her arms. A little mirror, framed in curiously carved ivory, picked up by her in an Indian bazaar 25 years ago, hung on a level with her face, and gave that face back to her. "I'm not ugly," she thought passionately. "I'm not. I still have some looks left. If only that girl hadn't come. And it was all my doing. And what made me write to both of them, Edward and Jimmy?" She turned the mirror aside and took up a pen. "My dear Jimmy," she wrote, "it will be better for us both if you take a holiday from here. Don't come again till I write for you. I'm sorry I made you so much disturbance tonight. Have a good time and a good rest, and don't worry. Your—" So far she had written when a tear dropped on the page, and she had to tear it up and begin again. This time she wrote to the end, "Your Lila." "I must post it now," she thought, "or he may not get it before tomorrow evening. I couldn't go through with this again." She hurried out with it and slipped it in a pillar-box. The night smelled of flowers, and, hastening back, she lay down and stayed awake for hours, tossing and staring at the dark. End of Part 3, Chapter 12. Part 3, Chapter 13 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 13. 1. Lila had pluck, but little patience. Her one thought was to get away, and she at once began setting up her affairs and getting a permit to return to South Africa. The excitements of purchase and preparation were as good an anodyne as any she could have taken. The perils at the sea were at full just then, and the prospect of danger gave her a sort of pleasure. If I go down, she thought, all the better, brisk instead of long and dreary. But when she had the permit and her cabin was booked, the irrevocability of her step came to her with full force. Should she see him again or no? Her boat started in 3 days, and she must decide. If in compunction he were to be affectionate, she knew she would never keep to her decision, and then the horror would begin again, till again she was forced to this same action. She let the hours go and go, till the very day before, when the ache to see him and the dread of it had become so unbearable that she could not keep quiet. Late that afternoon, everything to the last label ready, she went out, still undecided. An itch to turn the dagger in her wound, to know what had become of Noel, took her to Edward's house. Almost unconsciously she put on her prettiest frock, and spent an hour before the glass. A feverishness of soul, more than of body, which had hung about her ever since that night, gave her colour. She looked her prettiest, and she bought a gardenia at a shop in Baker Street and fastened it to her dress. Reaching the old square, she was astonished to see a board up with the words, "To let," though the house still looked inhabited. She rang and was shown into the drawing-room. She had only twice been in this house before, and for some reason, perhaps because of her own unhappiness, the old, rather shabby room struck her as pathetic, as if inhabited by the past. I wonder what his wife was like, she thought. And then she saw, hanging against a strip of black velvet on the wall, that faded colour sketch of the slender young woman leaning forward, with her hands crossed in her lap. The colouring was lavender and old ivory, with faint touches of rose. The eyes, so living, were a little like Gratian's. The whole face delicate, eager, good. Yes, she thought, he must have loved you very much. To say good-bye must have been hard. She was still standing before it when Pierson came in. That's a dear face, Edward. I've come to say good-bye. I'm leaving for South Africa tomorrow. And as her hand touched his, she thought, I must have been mad to think I could ever have made him love me. Are you leaving him? Lila nodded. That's very brave, and wonderful. Oh, no, needs must when the drivel drives, that's all. I don't give up happiness of my own accord. That's not within 100 miles of the truth. What I shall become I don't know, but nothing better, you may be sure. I give up because I can't keep, and you know why. Where is Noel? Down at the sea with George and Gratian. He was looking at her in wonder, and the pained, puzzled expression on his face angered her. I see the house is to let. Who'd have thought a child like that could root up 2 fossils like us? Never mind, Edward, there's the same blood in us. We'll keep our ends up in our own ways. Where are you going? They'll give me a chaplaincy in the East, I think. For a wild moment Lila thought, shall I offer to go with him, the 2 lost dogs together? What would have happened, Edward, if you had proposed to me that May week when we were a little bit in love? Which would it have been, worst for you or for me? You wouldn't have taken me, Lila. Oh, one never knows. But you never have been a priest then, and you never have become a saint. Don't use that silly word. If you knew. I do. I can see that you've been half burned alive, half burned and half buried. Well, you have your reward, whatever that is, and I mine. Good-bye, Edward. She took his hand. You might give me your blessing. I want it. Pierson put his other hand on her shoulder and, bending forward, kissed her forehead. The tears rushed up in Lila's eyes. Ah, me, she said, it's a sad world. And wiping the quivering off her lips with the back of her gloved hand, she went quickly past him to the door. She looked back from there. He had not stirred, but his lips were moving. He's praying for me, she thought. How funny. 2. The moment she was outside, she forgot him. The dreadful ache for thought seemed to have been whipped up within her, as if that figure of lifelong repression had infuriated the love of life and pleasure in her. She must and would see Jimmy again, if she had to wait and seek him all night. It was nearly 7. He would surely have finished at the War Office. He might be at his club or at his rooms. She made for the latter. The little street near Buckingham Gate, where no wag had chalked "Peace" on the doors for nearly a year now, had an arid look after a hot day's sun. The hairdresser's shop below his rooms was still open, and the private door ajar. I won't ring, she thought. I'll go straight up. While she was mounting the 2 flights of stairs, she stopped twice, breathless from a pain in her side. She often had that pain now, as if the longing in her heart strained it physically. On the modest landing at the top outside his rooms, she waited, leaning against the wall, which was covered with a red paper. A window at the back was open, and the confused sound of singing came in, a chorus, Vive la, vive la, vive la, vive la, vive la compagnie. So it came to her. Oh, God, she thought, let him be in, let him be nice to me. It's the last time. And sick from anxiety, she opened the door. He was in, lying on a wicker couch against the wall in the far corner, with his arms crossed behind his head and a pipe in his mouth. His eyes were closed, and he neither moved nor opened them, perhaps supposing her to be the servant. Noiseless as a cat, Lila crossed the room till she stood above him. And waiting for him to come out of that defiant lethargy, she took her fill of his thin, bony face, healthy and hollow at the same time. With teeth clenched on the pipe, it had a look of hard resistance, as of a man with his head back, his arms pinioned to his sides, stiffening against some creature, clinging and climbing and trying to drag him down. The pipe was alive and dribbled smoke, and his leg, the injured one, wriggled restlessly as if worrying him. but the rest of him was as utterly and obstinately still as though he were asleep. His hair grew thick and crisp, not a thread of grey in it. The teeth which held the pipe glinted white and strong. His face was young, so much younger than hers. Why did she love it, the face of a man who couldn't love her? For a second she felt as if she could seize the cushion which had slipped down off the couch and smother him as he lay there, refusing, so it seemed to her, to come to consciousness. Love despised, humiliation. She nearly turned and stole away. Then through the door, left open behind her, the sound of that chorus, Vive la, vive la, vive la, came in and jolted her nerves unbearably. Tearing the gardenia from her breast, she flung it onto his upturned face. "Jimmy!" Fort struggled up and stared at her. His face was comic with bewilderment, and she broke into a little nervous laugh. "You weren't dreaming of me, dear Jimmy, that's certain. In what garden were you wandering?"
"Lila, you, how jolly!"
How jolly! I wanted to see you, so I came, and I have seen you as you are when you aren't with me. I shall remember it. It was good for me, awfully good for me."
"I didn't hear you."
"Far, far away, my dear. Put my gardenia in your buttonhole. Stop, I'll pin it in. Have you had a good rest all this week? Do you like my dress? It's new. You wouldn't have noticed it, would you?"
"I should have noticed. I think it's charming."
"Jimmy, I believe that nothing will ever shake your chivalry."
"Chivalry I have none."
"I'm going to shut the door. Do you mind?" But he went to the door himself, shut it, and came back to her. Lila looked up at him. "Jimmy, if ever you love me a little bit, be nice to me today. And if I say things, if I'm bitter, don't mind, don't notice it. Promise?"
"I promise."
She took off her hat and sat leaning against him on the couch, so that she could not see his face. And with his arm round her, she let herself go, deep into the waters of illusion. Down, down, trying to forget there was a surface to which she must return. Like a little girl, she played that game of make-believe. He loves me, he loves me, he loves me. To lose herself like that for just an hour, only an hour. She felt that she would give the rest of the time vouchsafed to her, give it all, and willingly. Her hand clasped his against her heart. She turned her face backward, up to his, closing her eyes so as still not to see his face. The scent of the gardenia in his coat hurt her, so sweet and strong it was. 3. When with her hat on she stood ready to go, it was getting dark. She had come out of her dream now, was playing at make-believe no more. And she stood with a stony smile in the half-dark, looking between her lashes at the mortified expression on his unconscious face. "Poor Jimmy," she said, "I'm not going to keep you from dinner any longer. No, don't come with me. I'm going alone. And don't light up, for heaven's sake." She put her hand on the lapel of his coat. "That flower's gone brown at the edges. Throw it away. Can't bear faded flowers. Nor can you. Get yourself a fresh one tomorrow." She pulled the flower from his buttonhole, and, crushing it in her hand, held her face up. "Well, kiss me once more. It won't hurt you." For one moment her lips clung to his with all their might. She wrenched them away, felt for the handle blindly, opened the door, and shutting it in his face, went slowly, swaying a little, down the stairs. She trailed a gloved hand along the wall as if its solidity could help her. At the last half landing, where a curtain hung, dividing off back premises, she stopped and listened. There wasn't a sound. "If I stand here behind this curtain," she thought, "I shall see him again." She slipped behind the curtain, close drawn but for a little chink. It was so dark there that she could not see her own hand. She heard the door open, and his slow footsteps coming down the stairs. His feet, knees, whole figure came into sight, his face just a dim blur. He passed, smoking a cigarette. She crammed her hand against her mouth to stop herself from speaking, and the crushed gardenia filled her nostrils with its cold, fragrant velvet. He was gone. The door below was shut. A wild, half-stupid longing came on her to go up again, wait till he came in, throw herself upon him, tell him she was going, beg him to keep her with him. And he would. He would look at her with that haggard pity she could not bear, and say, "Of course, Lila, of course." "No, by God, no." "I'm going quietly home," she muttered, "just quietly home. Come along, be brave, don't be a fool. Come along." and she went down into the street. At the entrance to the park she saw him, 50 yards in front, dawdling along, and as if she had been his shadow lengthened out to that far distance, she moved behind him. Slowly, always at that distance, she followed him under the plane trees, along the park railings, past St. James's Palace, into Pall Mall. He went up some steps and vanished into his club. It was the end. She looked up at the building, a monstrous granite tomb, all dark. An emptied cab was just moving from the door. She got in. "Camelot Mansions, St. John's Wood." Braced against the cushions, panting and clenching her hands, she thought, "Well, I've seen him again. Hard crusts better than no bread. Oh, God! All finished. Not a crumb, not a crumb. Vive la, vive la, vive la vie, vive la compagnie." End of Part 3, Chapter 13. Part 3, Chapter 14 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 14. Fort had been lying there about an hour, sleeping and awake, before that visit. He had dreamed a curious and wonderfully emotionalizing dream. A long grey line, in a dim light, neither of night nor morning, the whole length of the battle front in France, charging in short drives, which carried the line a little forward, with just a tiny pause and suck back. Then on again irresistibly, on, and at each rush every voice, his own among them, shouted, "Hooray, the English! Hooray, the English!" The sensation of that advancing tide of dim figures in grey light, the throb and roar, the wonderful rhythmic steady drive of it, no more to be stopped than the waves of an incoming tide, was gloriously fascinating. Life was nothing, death nothing. Hooray, the English! In that dream he was in his country, he was every one of that long charging line, driving forward in those great heavy pulsations, irresistible, on and on. Out of the very centre of this intoxicating dream he had been dragged by some street noise, and had closed his eyes again in the vain hope that he might dream it on to its end. But it came no more, and, lighting his pipe, he lay there wondering at its fervid, fantastic realism. Death was nothing, if his country lived and won. In waking hours he never had quite that single-hearted knowledge of himself. And what marvellously real touches got mixed into the fantastic stuff of dreams, as if something were at work to convince the dreamer in spite of himself. Hooray! Not hurrah, just common hooray, and the English, not the literary British. And then the soft flower had struck his forehead, and Lila's voice cried, "Jimmy!" When she left him, his thought was just a tired, "Well, so it's begun again." What did it matter, since common loyalty and compassion cut him off from what his heart desired, and that desire was absurd, as little likely of attainment as the moon? What did it matter? If it gave her any pleasure to love him, let it go on. Yet all the time that he was walking across under the plane trees, Noel seemed to walk in front of him, just out of reach, so that he ached with the thought that he would never catch her up and walk beside her. 2 days later, on reaching his rooms in the evening, he found this letter on ship's notepaper with the Plymouth postmark. "Fare thee well, and if for ever, then for ever fare thee well. Lila." He read it with a horrible feeling, for all the world as if he had been accused of a crime and did not know whether he had committed it or not. And trying to collect his thoughts, he took a cab and drove to her flat. It was closed, but her address was given him, a bank in Cape Town. He had received his release. In his remorse and relief, so confusing and so poignant, he heard the driver of the cab asking where he wanted to go now. "Oh, back again." But before they had gone a mile, he corrected the address, in an impulse of which next moment he felt thoroughly ashamed. What he was doing, indeed, was as indecent as if he were driving from the funeral of his wife to the boudoir of another woman. When he reached the old square, and the words "To Let" stared him in the face, he felt a curious relief, though it meant that he would not see her whom to see for 10 minutes he felt he would give a year of life. Dismissing his cab, he stood debating whether to ring the bell. The sight of a maid's face at the window decided him. Mr. Pierson was out, and the young ladies were away. He asked for Mrs. Laird's address, and turned away almost into the arms of Pierson himself. The greeting was stiff and strange.
Does he know that Lila's gone?
he thought. If so, he must think me the most awful skunk. And am I? Am I? When he reached home, he sat down to write to Lila. But having stared at the paper for an hour, and writing these 3 lines,
My dear Lila, I cannot express to you the feelings with which I receive your letter,
he tore it up. Nothing would be adequate. Nothing would be decent. Let the dead past bury its dead. The dead past which in his heart had never been alive. Why pretend? He'd done his best to keep his end up. Why pretend? End of Part 3, Chapter 14. Part 4, Chapter 1 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 1. In the boarding-house, whence the lairds had not yet removed, the old lady who knitted sat by the fireplace, and light from the setting sun threw her shadow on the wall, moving spidery and grey over the yellowish distemper, in time to the tune of her needles. She was a very old lady, the oldest lady in the world, Noel thought, and she knitted without stopping, without breathing, so that the girl felt inclined to scream. In the evening, when George and Gratian were not in, Noel would often sit watching the needles, brooding over her as yet undecided future. And now and again the old lady would look up above her spectacles, move the corners of her lips ever so slightly, and drop her gaze again. She had pitted herself against fate. So long as she knitted, the war could not stop. Such was the conclusion Noel had come to. This old lady knitted the epic of acquiescence to the tune of her needles. It was she who kept the war going, such a thin old lady. If I were to hold her elbows from behind, the girl used to think, I believe she'd die. I expect I ought to. Then the war would stop. And if the war stopped, there'd be love and life again. Then the little silvery tune would click itself once more into her brain and stop her thinking. In her lap this evening lay a letter from her father. My dearest Nolly, I am glad to say I have my chaplaincy and am to start for Egypt very soon. I should have wished to go to France, but must take what I can get in view of my age, for they really don't want us who are getting on, I fear. It is a great comfort to me to think that Gratian is with you, and no doubt you will all soon be in a house where my little grandson can join you. I have excellent accounts of him in a letter from your aunt, just received. My child, you must never again think that my resignation has been due to you. It is not so. You know, or perhaps you don't, that ever since the war broke out, I've chafed over staying at home. My heart has been with our boys out there, and sooner or later it must have come to this, apart from anything else. Monsieur Lavendy has been round in the evening twice. He's a nice man. I like him very much, in spite of our differences of view. He wanted to give me the sketch he made of you in the park. What can I do with it now? And to tell you the truth, I like it no better than the oil painting. It is not a likeness, as I know you. I hope I didn't hurt his feelings. The feelings of an artist are so very easily wounded. There is one thing I must tell you. Lila has gone back to South Africa. She came round one evening about 10 days ago to say good-bye. She was very brave, for I fear it means a great wrench for her. I hope and pray she may find comfort and tranquillity out there. And now, my dear, I want you to promise me not to see Captain Fort. I know that he admires you, but apart from the question of his conduct in regard to Lila, he made the saddest impression on me by coming to our house the very day after her departure. There's something about that which makes me feel he cannot be the sort of man in whom I could feel any confidence. I don't suppose for a moment that he is in your thoughts, yet before going so far from you, I feel I must warn you. I should rejoice to see you married to a good man, but though I don't wish to think hardly of anyone, I cannot believe Captain Fort is that. I shall come down to you before I start, which may be in quite a short time now. My dear love to you and Gracie, and best wishes to George. Your ever-loving father, Edward Pierson. Across this letter, lying on her knees, Noel gazed at the spidery movement on the wall. Was it acquiescence that the old lady knitted, or was it resistance, a challenge to death itself, a challenge dancing to the tune of the needles like the grey ghost of human resistance to fate? She wouldn't give in, this oldest lady in the world. She meant to knit till she fell into the grave. And so Lila had gone. It hurt her to know that, and yet it pleased her. acquiescence, resistance. Why did Daddy always want to choose the way she should go? So gentle he was, yet he always wanted to. And why did he always make her feel that she must go the other way? The sunlight ceased to stream in. The old lady's shadow faded off the wall, but the needles still sang their little tune. And the girl said, "Do you enjoy knitting, Mrs. Adam?" The old lady looked at her above the spectacles. "Enjoy, my dear? It passes the time." "But do you want the time to pass?" There was no answer for a moment, and Noel thought, "How dreadful of me to have said that." "Eh?" said the old lady. "I said, isn't it very tiring?" "Not when I don't think about it, my dear." "What do you think about?" The old lady cackled gently. "Oh, well," she said. And Noel thought, it must be dreadful to grow old and pass the time. She took up her father's letter and bent it meditatively against her chin. He wanted her to pass the time, not to live, not to enjoy, to pass the time. What else had he been doing himself all these years, ever since she could remember, ever since her mother died, but just passing the time? Passing the time because he did not believe in this life, not living at all, just preparing for the life he did believe in. Denying himself everything that was exciting and nice, so that when he died he might pass pure and saintly to his other world. He could not believe Captain Fort a good man because he had not passed the time and resisted Lila. And Lila was gone. And now it was a sin for him to love someone else. He must pass the time again. Daddy doesn't believe in life, she thought. It's Monsieur's picture. Daddy's a saint, but I don't want to be a saint and pass the time. He doesn't mind making people unhappy, because the more they're repressed, the saintlier they'll be. But I can't bear to be unhappy, or to see others unhappy. I wonder if I could bear to be unhappy to save someone else, as Lila is. I admire her. Oh, I admire her. She's not doing it because she thinks it's good for her soul, only because she can't bear making him unhappy. She must love him very much. Poor Lila. And she's done it all by herself, of her own accord. It was like what George said of the soldiers. They didn't know why they were heroes. It was not because they'd been told to be, or because they believed in a future life. They just had to be, from inside somewhere, to save others. And they love life as much as I do, she thought. What a beast makes one feel. Those needles. Resistance? Acquiescence? Both, perhaps. The oldest lady in the world, with her lips moving at the corners, keeping things in, had lived her life, and knew it. How dreadful to live on when you were of no more interest to anyone, but must just pass the time and die. But how much more dreadful to pass the time when you were strong, and life and love were yours for the taking. I shan't answer, Daddy, she thought. End of Part 4, Chapter 1. Part 4, Chapter 2 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 2. The maid, who one Saturday in July opened the door to Jimmy Fort, had never heard the name of Laird, for she was but a unit in the ceaseless procession which passed through the boarding-houses of places subject to air raids. Placing him in a sitting-room, she said she would find Miss Allo. There he waited, turning the leaves of an illustrated journal, wherein society beauties, starving Servians, actresses with pretty legs, prize dogs, sinking ships, royalties, shells bursting, and padres reading funeral services, testified to the catholicity of the public taste, but did not assuage his nerves. What if their address were not known here? Why, in his fear of putting things to the test, had he let this month go by? An old lady was sitting by the hearth, knitting, the click of whose needles blended with the buzzing of a large bee on the window-pane. She may know, he thought. She looks as if she'd been here forever. And approaching her, he said, I can assure you those socks are very much appreciated, ma'am. The old lady bridled over her spectacles. It passes the time, she said. Oh, more than that. It helps to win the war, ma'am. The old lady's lips moved at the corners. She did not answer. Deaf, he thought. May I ask if you knew my friends, Dr. and Mrs. Laird, and Miss Pierson? The old lady cackled gently. Oh, yes, Pretty young girl, as pretty as life. She used to sit with me. Quite a pleasure to watch her. Such large eyes she had."
"Where have they gone? Can you tell me?"
"Oh, I don't know at all." There was a little cold douche on his heart. He longed to say,
"Stop knitting a minute, please. It's my life to know."
But the tune of the needles answered, "It's my life to knit," and he turned away to the window. "She used to sit just there, quite still, quite still." Fort looked down at the window-seat. So she used to sit just here, quite still. "What a dreadful war this is," said the old lady. "Have you been at the front?"
"Yes."
"To think of the poor young girls who never have husbands. I'm sure I think it's dreadful."
"Yes," said Fort, it's dreadful."
And then a voice from the doorway said, "Do you want Dr. and Mrs. Laird, sir? East Bungalow, their address is. It's a little way out on the North Road. Anyone will tell you." With a sigh of relief, Fort looked gratefully at the old lady who had called Noel as pretty as life.
"Good afternoon, ma'am."
"Good afternoon." The needles clicked, and little movements occurred at the corners of her mouth. Fort went out. He could not find a vehicle, and was a long time walking. The bungalow was ugly, of yellow brick pointed with red. It lay about 2/3 up between the main road and cliffs, and had a rock garden and a glaring, brand-new look in the afternoon sunlight. He opened the gate, uttering one of those prayers which come so glibly from unbelievers when they want anything. A baby's crying answered it, and he thought with ecstasy,
"Heaven, she is here."
Passing the rock garden, he could see a lawn at the back of the house, and a perambulator out there under a home oak tree. And Noel, surely Noel herself. Hardening his heart, he went forward. In a lilac sunbonnet she was bending over the perambulator. He trod softly on the grass, and was quite close before she heard him. He had prepared no words, but just held out his hand. The baby, interested in the shadow falling across its pram, ceased crying. Noel took his hand. Under the sunbonnet which hid her hair, she seemed older and paler, as if she felt the heat. He had no feeling that she was glad to see him. "How do you do? Have you seen Gratian? She ought to be in."
"I didn't come to see her. I came to see you."
Noel turned to the baby. "Here he is." Fort stood at the end of the perambulator and looked at that other fellow's baby. In the shade of the hood, with the frilly clothes, it seemed to him lying with its head downhill. It had scratched its snub nose and bumpy forehead, and it stared up at its mother with blue eyes, so fat were its cheeks.
"I wonder what they think about," he said.
Noel put her finger into the baby's fist. "They only think when they want something."
"That's a deep saying, but his eyes are awfully interested in you."
Noel smiled, and very slowly the baby's curly mouth unclosed and discovered his toothlessness. "He's a darling," she said in a whisper.
"So are you," he thought, "if only I dared say it."
"Daddy is here," she said suddenly, without looking up. "He's sailing for Egypt the day after tomorrow. He doesn't like you." Fort's heart gave a jump. Why did she tell him that unless she was just a little on his side?
"I expected that," he said. "I'm a sinner, as you know."
Noel looked up at him. "Sin," she said, and bent again over her baby. The word, the tone in which she said it, crouching over her baby, gave him the thought,
"If it weren't for that little creature, I shouldn't have a dog's chance." He said, "I'll go and see your father. Is he in?"
"I think so."
"May I come tomorrow?"
"It's Sunday, and Daddy's last day."
"No, of course."
He did not dare look back to see if her gaze was following him, but he thought,
"Chance or no chance, I'm going to fight for her tooth and nail."
In a room darkened against the evening sun, Pierson was sitting on a sofa reading. The sight of that figure in khaki disconcerted Fort, who had not realized that there would be this metamorphosis. The narrow face, clean-shaven now, with its deep-set eyes and compressed lips, looked more priestly than ever, in spite of this brown garb. He felt his hopes suddenly to be very forlorn indeed, and rushing up the fence, he began abruptly,
"I've come to ask you, sir, for your permission to marry Noel, if she will have me."
He thought Pierson's face gentle. It was not gentle now. "Did you know I was here, then, Captain Fort?"
"I saw Noel in the garden. I said nothing to her, of course, but you told me you were starting tomorrow for Egypt, so I shall have no other chance."
I am sorry you have come. It is not for me to judge, but I don't think you will make Noel happy.
May I ask you why, sir?
Captain Fort, the world's judgment of these things is not mine, but since you ask me, I will tell you frankly. My cousin Lila has a claim on you. It is her you should ask to marry you.
I did ask her, but she refused.
I know. She would not refuse you again if you went out to her.
I am not free to go out to her. Besides, she would refuse. She knows I don't love her, and never have.
Never have?
No.
Then why?
Because I'm a man, I suppose, and a fool.
If it was simply because you are a man, as you call it, it is clear that no principle or faith governs you. And yet you ask me to give you Noel, my poor Noel, who wants the love and protection not of a man, but of a good man. No, Captain Fort, no. Fort bit his lips.
I'm clearly not a good man in your sense of the word, but I love her terribly, and I would protect her. I don't in the least know whether she'll have me. I don't expect her to, naturally. But I warn you that I mean to ask her, and to wait for her. I'm so much in love that I can do nothing else.
The man who is truly in love does what is best for the one he loves. Fort bent his head. He felt as if he were at school again, confronting his headmaster.
That's true, he said, and I shall never trade on her position. If she can't feel anything for me now, or in the future, I shan't trouble her, you may be sure of that. But if by some wonderful chance she should, I know I can make her happy, sir.
She is a child.
No, she's not a child, said Fort stubbornly.
Pierson touched the lapel of his new tunic. Captain Fort, I am going far away from her, and leaving her without protection. I trust your chivalry not to ask her till I come back.
Fort threw back his head. No, I won't accept that position. With or without your presence, the fact will be the same. Either she can love me or she can't. If she can, she'll be happier with me. If she can't, there's an end of it.
Pierson came slowly up to him. In my view, he said, you are as bound to Lila as if you were married to her.
You can't expect me to take the priest's view, sir.
Pierson's lips trembled. You call it a priest's view. I think it is only the view of a man of honour.
Fort reddened. That's for my conscience, he said stubbornly. I can't tell you, and I'm not going to tell you how things began. I was a fool, but I did my best, and I know that Lila doesn't think I'm bound. If she had, she would never have gone. When there's no feeling, there never was any real feeling on my side, and when there's this terribly real feeling for Noel, which I never sought, which I tried to keep down, which I ran away from.
Did you?
Yes.
To go on with the other was foul. I should have thought you might have seen that, sir, but I did go on with it. It was Lila who made an end. Lila behaved nobly, I think.
She was splendid, but that doesn't make me a brute.
Pierson turned away to the window, whence he must see Noel. It is repugnant to me, he said. Is there never to be any purity in her life?
Is there never to be any life for her? At your rate, sir, there will be none. I'm no worse than other men, and I love her more than they could.
For fully a minute Pierson stood silent before he said, Forgive me if I've spoken harshly. I didn't mean to. I love her intensely. I wish for nothing but her good. But all my life I have believed that for a man there is only one woman, for a woman only one man.
Then, sir, Fort burst out, you wish her—
Pierson had put his hand up as if to ward off a blow, and angry though he was, Fort stopped.
We're all made of flesh and blood, he continued coldly, and it seems to me that you think we aren't.
We have spirits, too, Captain Fort. The voice was suddenly so gentle that Fort's anger evaporated.
I have a great respect for you, sir, but a greater love for Noel, and nothing in this world will prevent me trying to give my life to her.
A smile quivered over Pierson's face. If you try, then I can but pray that you will fail. Fort did not answer, and went out. He walked slowly away from the bungalow, with his head down, sore, angry, and yet relieved. He knew where he stood, nor did he feel that he had been worsted. Those strictures had not touched him. Convicted of immorality, he remained conscious of private justifications in a way that human beings have. Only one little corner of memory, unseen and uncriticised by his opponent, troubled him. He pardoned himself the rest. The one thing he did not pardon was the fact that he had known Noel before his liaison with Lila commenced, and even let Lila sweep him away on an evening when he had been in Noel's company. For that he felt a real disgust with himself. And all the way back to the station he kept thinking, "How could I? I deserve to lose her. Still, I shall try, but not now, not yet." And wearily enough he took the train back to town. End of Part 4, Chapter 2. Part 4, Chapter 3 of Saints' Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 3. Both girls rose early that last day and went with their father to communion. As Gratian had said to George, "It's nothing to me now, but it will mean a lot to him out there as a memory of us, so I must go." And he had answered, "Quite right, my dear. Let him have all he can get of you both today. I'll keep out of the way, and be back the last thing at night." Their father's smile when he saw them waiting for him went straight to both their hearts. It was a delicious day, and the early freshness had not yet dried out of the air when they were walking home to breakfast. Each girl had slipped a hand under his arm. "It's like Moses, or was it Aaron?" Noel thought absurdly. Memory had complete hold of her. All the old days, nursery hours on Sundays after tea, stories out of the huge Bible bound in mother-of-pearl with photogravures of the Holy Land, palms and hills and goats and little Eastern figures and funny boats on the Sea of Galilee and camels, always camels. The book would be on his knee, and they, one on each arm of his chair, waiting eagerly for the pages to be turned so that a new picture came, and there would be the feel of his cheek prickly against theirs, and the old names with the old glamour, to Gratian, Joshua, Daniel, Mordecai, Peter; to Noel, Absalom because of his hair, and Haman because she liked the sound, and Ruth because she was pretty, and John because he leaned on Jesus' breast. Neither of them cared for Job or David, and Elijah and Elisha they detested because they hated the name Eliza. And later days, by firelight in the drawing-room, roasting chestnuts just before evening church, and telling ghost stories, and trying to make Daddy eat his share. And hours beside him at the piano, each eager for their special hymns. For Gratian, Onward, Christian Soldiers, Lead, Kindly Light, and O God, Our Help. For Noel, Nearer, My God, to Thee, the one with the hosts of Midian in it, and For Those in Peril on the Sea. And carols! And choristers! Noel had loved one deeply. The word chorister was so enchanting, and because of his whiteness and hair which had no grease on it but stood up all bright, she had never spoken to him of fire-worship like that for a star. And always, always Daddy had been gentle, sometimes angry, but always gentle, and they sometimes not at all. And mixed up with it all, the dogs they'd had, and the cats they'd had, and the cockatoo, and the governesses, and their red cloaks, and the curates, and the pantomimes, and Peter Pan, and Alice in Wonderland, Daddy sitting between them so they could snuggle up. And later, the school days, the hockey, the prizes, the holidays, the rush into his arms, and the great and wonderful yearly exodus to far places, fishing and bathing, walks and drives, rides and climbs, always with him. And concerts and Shakespeare plays in the Christmas and Easter holidays, and the walk home through the streets, all lighted in those days, one on each side of him. And this was the end. They waited on him at breakfast. They kept stealing glances at him, photographing him in their minds. Gratian got her camera and did actually photograph him in the morning sunlight, with Noel, without Noel, with the baby, against all regulations for the defence of the realm. It was Noel who suggested, "Daddy, let's take lunch out and go for all day on the cliffs, us three, and forget there's a war." So easy to say, so difficult to do, with the boom of the guns travelling to their ears along the grass, mingled with the buzz of insects. Yet that hum of summer, the innumerable voices of tiny lives, gossamer things all as alive as they, and as important to their frail selves, and the white clouds, few and so slow-moving, and the remote strange purity which clings to the chalky downs, all this white and green and blue of land and sea had its peace, which crept into the spirits of those three, alone with nature, this once more, the last time for who could say how long? They talked, by tacit agreement, of nothing but what had happened before the war began, while the flock of the blown dandelions drifted past. Pierson sat cross-legged on the grass, without his cap, suffering a little still from the stiffness of his unwonted garments. And the girls lay one on each side of him, half critical and half admiring. Noel could not bear his collar. "If you had a soft collar, you'd be lovely, Daddy. Perhaps out there they'll let you take it off. It must be fearfully hot in Egypt. Oh, I wish I were going. I wish I were going everywhere in the world. Some day." Presently he read to them Murray's Hippolytus of Euripides, and now and then Gratian and he discussed a passage. But Noel lay silent, looking at the sky. Whenever his voice ceased, there was the song of the larks, and very faint the distant mutter of the guns. They stayed up there till past 6, and it was time to go and have tea before evening service. Those hours in the baking sun had drawn virtue out of them. They were silent and melancholy all the evening. Noel was the first to go up to her bedroom. She went without saying good night. She knew her father would come to her room that last evening. George had not yet come in, and Gratian was left alone with Pierson in the drawing-room, round whose single lamp, in spite of close-drawn curtains, moths were circling. She moved over to him on the sofa. "Dad, promise me not to worry about Nolly. We'll take care of her." "She can only take care of herself, Gracie. And will she? Did you know that Captain Fort was here yesterday?" "She told me." "What is her feeling about him?" "I don't think she knows. Nolly dreams along, and then suddenly rushes." "I wish she were safe from that man." "But, Dad, why? George likes him, and so do I." A big grey moth was fluttering against the lamp. Pierson got up and caught it in the curve of his palm. "Poor thing, you're like my Nolly, so soft and dreamy, so feckless, so reckless." And, going to the curtains, he thrust his hand through and released the moth. "Dad," said Gratian suddenly, "we can only find out for ourselves, even if we do singe our wings in doing it. We've been reading James's Pragmatism. George says the only chapter that's important is missing, the one on ethics, to show that what we do is not wrong till it's proved wrong by the result. I suppose he was afraid to deliver that lecture." Pierson's face wore the smile which always came on it when he had to deal with George, the smile which said, "Ah, George, that's very clever, but I know." "My dear," he said, "that doctrine is the most dangerous in the world. I am surprised at George." "I don't think George is in danger, Dad." "George is a man of wide experience and strong judgment and character. But think how fatal it would be for Nolly, my poor Nolly, whom a little gust can blow into the candle." "All the same," said Gratian stubbornly, "I don't think anyone can be good or worth anything unless they judge to themselves and take risks." Pierson went close to her. His face was quivering. "Don't let us differ on this last night. I must get up to Nolly for a minute and then to bed. I shan't see you tomorrow. You mustn't get up. I can bear parting better like this. And my train goes at 8. God bless you, Gracie. Give George my love. I have always known that he's a good man, though we do fight so. Good-bye, my darling." He went out with his cheeks wet from Gratian's tears, and stood in the porch a minute to recover his composure. The shadow of the house stretched velvet and blunt over the rock garden. A night-jar was spinning. The churring sound affected him oddly. The last English night-bird he would hear. England. What a night to say good-bye. My country, he thought. My beautiful country. The dew was lying thick and silvery already on the little patch of grass. The last dew, the last scent of an English night. The call of a bugle floated out. England, he prayed. God be about you. A little sound answered from across the grass like an old man's cough and the scrape and rattle of a chain. A face emerged at the end of the house's shadow, bearded and horned like that of Pan. It seemed to stare at him. And he saw the dim grey form of the garden goat, heard it scuttle round the stake to which it was tethered, as though alarmed at this visitor to its domain. He went up the half-flight of stairs to Noel's narrow little room next to the nursery. No voice answered his tap. It was dark, but he could see her at the window, leaning far out with her chin on her hands. "Nolly?" She answered without turning. "Such a lovely night, Daddy. Come and look. I'd like to set the goat free, only to eat the rock plants. But it is his night, isn't it? He ought to be running and skipping in it. Such a shame to tie things up. Did you never feel wild in your heart, Daddy?" "Always, I think, Nolly. Too wild. It's been hard to tame oneself." Noel slipped her hand through his arm. "Let's go and take the goat and skip together on the hills. If only we had a penny whistle. Did you hear the bugle? The bugle and the goat?" Pierson pressed the hand against him. "Nolly, be good while I'm away. You know what I don't want. I told you in my letter." He looked at her cheek and dared say no more. Her face had its fey look again. "Don't you feel," she said suddenly, "on a night like this, all the things, the stars have lives, Daddy, and the moon has a big life, and the shadows have, and the moths, and the birds, and the goats, and the trees, and the flowers, and all of us, escaped? Oh, Daddy, why is there a war? And why are people so bound and so unhappy? Don't tell me it's God, don't." Pierson could not answer, for there came into his mind the Greek song he had been reading aloud that afternoon. "Over a deep and dewy spring, with runlets cold to draw and drink, and a great meadow blossoming, long-grassed, and poplars in a ring. To rest me by the brink, oh, take me to the mountain, oh, past the great pines and through the wood, up where the lean hounds softly go, a wine for wild things, blood. And madly flies the dappled roe, O God, to shout and speed them there, an arrow by my chestnut hair, drawn tight, and one keen glimmering spear. Ah, if I could!" All that in life had been to him unknown, of venture and wild savour, all the emotion he had stifled, the swift pan he had denied, the sharp fruits, the burning suns, the dark pools, the unearthly moonlight, which were not of God, all came with the breath of that old song, and the look on the girl's face, and he covered his eyes. Noel's hand tugged at his arm. "Isn't beauty terribly alive?" she murmured, "like a lovely person? Makes you ache to kiss it." His lips felt parched. "There is a beauty beyond all that," he said stubbornly. "Where?" "Holiness, duty, faith, oh, Nolly, my love." But Noel's hand tightened on his arm. "Shall I tell you what I should like?" she whispered. "To take God's hand and show him things. I'm certain he's not seen everything." A shudder went through Pierson, one of those queer sudden shivers which come from a strange note in a voice or a new sharp scent or sight. "My dear, what things you say!" "But he hasn't, and it's time he did. We'd creep and peep and see it all for once, as he can't in his churches. Daddy, oh, Daddy, I can't bear it any more to think of them being killed on a night like this, killed and killed so that they never see it all again. Never see it? Never see it?" She sank down and covered her face with her arms. I can't. Oh, take it all away, the cruelty. Why does it come? Why the stars and the flowers, if God doesn't care any more than that?" Horribly affected, he stood bending over her, stroking her head. Then the habit of 100 deathbeds helped him. "Come, Nolly, this life is but a minute. We must all die." "But not they, not so young." She clung to his knees and looked up. "Daddy, I don't want you to go. Promise me to come back." The childishness of those words brought back his balance. "My dear sweetheart, of course. Come, Nolly, get up. The sun's been too much for you." Noel got up and put her hands on her father's shoulders. "Forgive me for all my badness, and all my badness to come, especially all my badness to come." Pierson smiled. "I shall always forgive you, Nolly, but there mustn't be any badness to come. I pray God to keep you and make you like your mother." "Mother never had a devil like you and me." He was silent from surprise. How did this child know the devil of wild feeling he had fought against year after year, until with the many years he had felt it weakening within him? She whispered on. I don't hate my devil. Why should I? It's part of me. Every day when the sun sets, I'll think of you, Daddy. And you might do the same. That'll keep me good. I shan't come to the station tomorrow. I should only cry. And I shan't say good-bye now. It's unlucky. She flung her arms round him, and, half smothered by that fervent embrace, he kissed her cheeks and hair. Freed of each other at last, he stood for a moment looking at her by the moonlight. There never was anyone more loving than you, Nolly, he said quietly. Remember my letter, and good night, my love. Then, afraid to stay another second, he went quickly out of the dark little room. George Laird, returning half an hour later, heard a voice saying softly, George, George. Looking up, he saw a little white blur at the window, and Noel's face just visible. George, let the goat loose, just for tonight, to please me. Something in that voice, and in the gesture of her stretched-out arm, moved George in a queer way, although, as Pierson had once said, he had no music in his soul. He loosed the goat. End of Part 4, Chapter 3. Part 4, Chapter 4 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 4. 1. In the weeks which succeeded Pierson's departure, Gratian and George often discussed Noel's conduct and position by the light of the pragmatic theory. George held a suitably scientific view. Just as he would point out to his wife, in the physical world, creatures who diverged from the normal had to justify their divergence in competition with their environments, or else go under. So in the ethical world it was all a question of whether Nolly could make good her vagary. If she could, and grew in strength of character thereby, it was ipso facto all right. Her vagary would be proved an advantage, and the world enriched. If not, the world by her failure to make good would be impoverished, and her vagary proved wrong. The orthodox and academies, he insisted, were always forgetting the adaptability of living organisms, how every action which was out of the ordinary unconsciously modified all the other actions together with the outlook and philosophy of the doer. Of course Nolly was crazy, he said, but when she did what she did, she at once began to think differently about life and morals. The deepest instinct we all have is the instinct that we must do what we must, and think that what we've done is really all right. In fact, the instinct of self-preservation. We're all fighting animals, and we feel in our bones that if we admit we're beaten, we are beaten, but that every fight we win, especially against odds, hardens those bones. But personally, I don't think she can make good on her own. Gratian, whose pragmatism was not yet fully baked, responded doubtfully, No, I don't think she can, and if she could, I'm not sure. But isn't pragmatism a perfectly beastly word, George? It has no sense of humour in it at all. It is a bit thick, and in the hands of the young, it's used likely to become pragmatism. But not with Nolly. They watched the victim of their discussions with real anxiety. The knowledge that she would never be more sheltered than she was with them, at all events until she married, gravely impeded the formation of any judgment as to whether or no she could make good. Now and again there would come to Gratian, who after all knew her sister better than George, the disquieting thought that whatever conclusion Noel led them to form, she would almost certainly force them to abandon sooner or later. 3 days after her father's departure, Noel had declared that she wanted to work on the land. This George had promptly vetoed. You aren't strong enough yet, my dear. Wait till the harvest begins, then you can go and help on the farm here. If you can stand that without damage, we'll think about it. But the weather was wet and harvest late, and Noel had nothing much to do but attend to her baby, already well attended to by nurse, and dream and brood, and now then cook an omelette or do some housework for the sake of a gnawing conscience. Since Gratian and George were away in hospital all day, she was very much alone. Several times in the evenings Gratian tried to come at the core of her thoughts. Twice she flew the kite of Lila. The first time Noel only answered, "Yes, she's a brick." The second time she said, "I don't want to think about her." But, hardening her heart, Gratian went on, "Don't you think it's queer we've never heard from Captain Fort since he came down?" In her calmest voice, Noel answered, "Why should we, after being told that he wasn't liked?" "Who told him that?" "I told him that Daddy didn't, but I expect Daddy said much worse things." She gave a little laugh, then softly added, "Daddy's wonderful, isn't he?" "How?" "The way he drives one to do the other thing. If he hadn't opposed my marriage to Cyril, you know, that wouldn't have happened. It just made all the difference. It stirred me up so fearfully." Gratian stared at her, astonished that she could see herself so clearly. Towards the end of August she had a letter from Fort. "Dear Mrs. Lloyd, you know all about things, of course, except the one thing which to me is all important. I can't go on without knowing whether I have a chance with your sister. It is against your father's express wish that he should have anything to do with me, but I told him that I could not and would not promise not to ask her. I get my holiday at the end of this month, and am coming down to put it to the touch. It means more to me than you can possibly imagine. I am, dear Mrs. Lloyd, your very faithful servant, James Fort." She discussed the letter with George, whose advice was, "Answer it politely, but say nothing, and nothing to Nolly. I think it would be a very good thing. Of course it's a bit of a makeshift, twice her age, but he's a genuine man, if not exactly brilliant." Gratian answered almost suddenly, "I've always wanted the very best for Nolly." George screwed up his steel-coloured eyes, as he might have looked at one on whom he had to operate. "Quite so," he said, "but you must remember, Gracie, that out of the swan she was, Nolly has made herself into a lame duck. 50% at least is off her value, socially. We must look at things as they are." "Father is dead against it." George smiled, on the point of saying, "That makes me feel it must be a good thing," but he subdued the impulse. "I agree that we're bound by his absence not to further it actively. Still, Nolly knows his wishes, and it's up to her and no one else. After all, she's no longer a child." His advice was followed, but to write that polite letter, which said nothing, cost Gratian a sleepless night and 2 or 3 hours' penmanship. She was very conscientious. Knowledge of this impending visit increased the anxiety with which she watched her sister. But the only inkling she obtained of Noel's state of mind was when the girl showed her a letter she had received from Thirza, asking her to come back to Kestrel. A postscript in Uncle Bob's handwriting added these words: "We're getting quite fossilized down here. Eve's gone and left us again. We miss you and the youngster awfully. Come along down, Nolly, there's a dear." "They're darlings," Noel said, "but I shan't go. I'm too restless ever since Daddy went. You don't know how restless. This rain simply makes me want to die." 2. The weather improved next day, and at the end of that week harvest began. By what seemed to Noel a stroke of luck, the farmer's binder was broken. He could not get it repaired, and wanted all the human binders he could get. That first day in the fields blistered her hands, burnt her face and neck, made every nerve and bone in her body ache, but was the happiest day she had spent for weeks, the happiest perhaps since Cyril Morland left her, over a year ago. She had a bath and went to bed the moment she got in. Lying there, nibbling chocolate and smoking a cigarette, she luxuriated in the weariness which had stilled her dreadful restlessness. Watching the smoke of her cigarette curl up against the sunset glow which filled her window, she mused, if only she could be tired out like this every day. She would be all right then, would lose the feeling of not knowing what she wanted, of being in a sort of large box with the lid slammed down, roaming around it like a dazed and homesick bee in an overturned tumbler. The feeling of only being half alive, of having a wing maimed so that she could only fly a little way, and must then drop. She slept like a top that night, but the next day's work was real torture, and the third not much better. By the end of the week, however, she was no longer stiff. Saturday was cloudless, a perfect day. The field she was working in lay on a slope. It was the last field to be cut, and the best wheat yet, with a glorious burnt shade in its gold, and the ears blunt and full. She got used now to the feel of the great sheaves in her arms, and the binding wisps drawn through her hand till she held them level below the ears, ready for the twist. There was no new sensation in it now, just steady, rather dreamy work, to keep her place in the road, to the swish-swish of the cutter and the call of the driver to his horses at the turns, with continual little pauses to straighten and rest her back a moment, and shake her head free from the flies, or suck her finger, sore from the constant pushing of the straw ends under. So the hours went on, rather hot and wearisome, yet with a feeling of something good being done, of a job getting surely to its end. And gradually the centre patch narrowed, and the sun slowly slanted down. When they stopped for tea, instead of running home as usual, she drank it cold out of a flask she had brought, ate a bun and some chocolate, and lay down on her back against the hedge. She always avoided that group of her fellow workers round the tea-cans which the farmer's wife brought out. To avoid people, if she could, had become habitual to her now. They must know about her, or would soon if she gave them the chance. She had never lost consciousness of her ring finger, expecting every eye to fall on it as a matter of course. Lying on her face, she puffed her cigarette into the grass and watched a beetle, till one of the sheep-dogs, scouting for scraps, came up, and she fed him with her second bun. Having finished the bun, he tried to eat the beetle, and when she rescued it, convinced that she had nothing more to give him, sneezed at her and went away. Pressing the end of her cigarette out against the bank, she turned over. Already the driver was perched on his tiny seat, and his companion, whose business it was to free the falling corn, was getting up alongside. Swish, swish. It had begun again. She rose, stretched herself, and went back to her place in the row. The field would be finished tonight. She would have a lovely rest, all Sunday. Towards 7 o'clock, a narrow strip not 20 yards broad alone was left. This last half-hour was what Noel dreaded. To-day it was worse, for the farmer had no cartridges left, and the rabbits were dealt with by hullabaloo and sticks and chasing good dogs. Rabbits were vermin, of course, and ate the crops and must be killed. Besides, they were good food, and fetched 2 shillings apiece. All this she knew, but to see the poor frightened things stealing out, pounced on, turned, shouted at, chased, rolled over by great swift dogs, fallen on by the boys and killed and carried with their limp grey bodies upside down, so dead and soft and helpless, always made her feel quite sick. She stood very still, trying not to see or hear, and in the corn opposite to her a rabbit stole along, crouched and peeped. "Oh," she thought, "come out here, Bunny. I'll let you away. Can't you see I will? It's your only chance. Come out." But the rabbit crouched and gazed, with its little cowed head poked forward and its ears laid flat. It seemed trying to understand whether this still thing in front of it was the same as those others. With the thought, "Of course it won't while I look at it," Noel turned her head away. Out of the corner of her eye she could see a man standing a few yards off. The rabbit bolted out. Now the man would shout and turn it. But he did not, and the rabbit scuttled past him and away to the hedge. She heard a shout from the end of the row, saw a dog galloping. Too late! Hurrah! And clasping her hands, she looked at the man. It was Fort. With the queerest feeling, amazement, pleasure, the thrill of conspiracy, she saw him coming up to her. "I did want that rabbit to get off," she sighed out. "I've been watching it. Thank you." He looked at her. "My goodness," was all he said. Noel's hands flew up to her cheeks. "Yes, I know. Is my nose very red?" "No, you're as lovely as Ruth, if she was lovely." Swish, swish. The cutter came by. Noel started forwards to her place in the row. But catching her arm, he said, "No, let me do this little bit. I haven't had a day in the field since the war began. Talk to me while I'm binding." She stood watching him. He made a different, stronger twist from hers, and took larger sheaves, so that she felt a sort of jealousy. "I didn't know you knew about this sort of thing." "Oh, Lord, yes. I had a farm once, out west. Nothing like field work to make you feel good. I've been watching you. You bind jolly well." Noel gave a sigh of pleasure. "Where have you come from?" she asked. "Straight from the station. I'm on my holiday." He looked up at her, and they both fell silent. Swish, swish. The cutter was coming again. Noel went to the beginning of her portion of the falling corn, he to the end of it. They worked towards each other, and met before the cutter was on them a third time. "Will you come in to supper?"
"I'd love to."
"Then let's go now, please. I don't want to see any more rabbits killed." They spoke very little on the way to the bungalow, but she felt his eyes on her all the time. She left him with George and Gratian, who had just come in, and went up for her bath. Supper had been laid out in the veranda, and it was nearly dark before they had finished. In rhyme with the falling of the light, Noel became more and more silent. When they went in, she ran up to her baby. She did not go down again, but as on the night before her father went away, stood at the window, leaning out. The dark night, no moon. In the starlight she could only just see the dim garden, where no goat was grazing. Now that her first excitement had worn off, this sudden reappearance of thought filled her with nervous melancholy. She knew perfectly well what he had come for. She had always known. She had no certain knowledge of her own mind, but she knew that all these weeks she had been between his influence and her father's, listening to them, as it were, pleading with her. And curiously, the pleading of each, instead of drawing her towards the pleader, had seemed dragging her away from him, driving her into the arms of the other. To the protection of one or the other she felt she must go, and it humiliated her to think that in all the world there was no other place for her. The wildness of that one night in the old abbey seemed to have power to govern all her life to come. Why should that one night, that one act, have this uncanny power to drive her this way or that, to those arms or these? Must she, because of it, always need protection? Standing there in the dark, it was almost as if they had come up behind her with their pleadings, and a shiver ran down her back. She longed to turn on them and cry out, "Go away! Oh, go away! I don't want either of you. I just want to be left alone." Then something, a moth perhaps, touched her neck. She gasped and shook herself. How silly! She heard the back door round the corner of the house opening, a man's low voice down in the dark say, "Who's the young lady that comes out in the fields?" Another voice, one of the maids, answered, "The missus' sister." "They say she's got a baby." "Never you mind what she's got." Noel heard the man's laugh. It seemed to her the most odious laugh she had ever heard. She thought swiftly and absurdly, "I'll get away from all this." The window was only a few feet up. She got up out onto the ledge, let herself down, and dropped. There was a flower bed below, quite soft, with a scent of geranium leaves and earth. She brushed herself and went tiptoeing across the gravel and the little front lawn to the gate. The house was quite dark, quite silent. She walked on down the road. Jolly, she thought. Night after night we sleep, and never see the nights. Sleep until we're called, and never see anything. If they want to catch me, they'll have to run. And she began running down the road in her evening frock and shoes, with nothing on her head. She stopped, after going perhaps 300 yards, by the edge of the wood. It was splendidly dark in there, and she groped her way from trunk to trunk with a delicious half-scared sense of adventure and novelty. She stopped at last by a thin trunk whose bark glimmered faintly. She felt it with her cheek, quite smooth, a birch tree, and with her arms round it she stood perfectly still. Wonderfully, magically silent, fresh and sweet-scented and dark. The little tree trembled suddenly within her arms, and she heard the low, distant rumble to which she had grown so accustomed. The guns, always at work, killing men and killing trees, little trees perhaps like this within her arms, little trembling trees. Out there in this dark night there would not be a single unscarred tree like this smooth, quivering thing. No fields of corn, not even a bush or a blade of grass, no leaves to rustle and smell sweet, not a bird, no little soft-footed night beasts, except the rats. And she shuddered, thinking of the Belgian soldier painter. Holding the tree tight, she squeezed its smooth body against her. A rush of the same helpless, hopeless revolt and sorrow overtook her, which had wrung from her that passionate little outburst to her father the night before he went away. Killed, torn and bruised, burned and killed, like Cyril. all the young things, like this little tree. Rumble, rumble, quiver, quiver, and all else so still, so sweet and still and starry, up there through the leaves. I can't bear it, she thought. She pressed her lips, which the sun had warmed all day, against the satiny smooth bark. But the little tree stood within her arms insentient, quivering only to the long rumbles. With each of those dull mutterings, life and love were going out, like the flames of candles on a Christmas tree, blown one by one. To her eyes, accustomed by now to the darkness in there, the wood seemed slowly to be gathering a sort of life, as though it were a great thing watching her, a great thing with hundreds of limbs and eyes and the power of breathing. The little tree, which had seemed so individual and friendly, ceased to be a comfort and became a part of the whole living wood, absorbed in itself and coldly watching her, this intruder of the mischievous breed, the fatal breed which loosed these rumblings on the earth. Noel unlocked her arms and recoiled. A bough scraped her neck. Some leaves flew against her eyes. She stepped aside, tripped over a root, and fell. A bough had hit her too, and she lay a little dazed, quivering at such dark unfriendliness. She held her hands up to her face for the mere pleasure of seeing something a little less dark. It was childish and absurd, but she was frightened. The wood seemed to have so many eyes, so many arms, and all unfriendly. It seemed waiting to give her other blows, other falls, and to guard her within its darkness until... She got up, moved a few steps, and stood still. She had forgotten from where she had come in. And afraid of moving deeper into the unfriendly wood, she turned slowly round, trying to tell which way to go. It was all just one dark, watching thing of limbs on the ground and in the air. Any way, she thought, any way, of course, will take me out. And she groped forward, keeping her hands up to guard her face. It was silly, but she could not help the sinking, scattered feeling which comes to one bushed or lost in a fog. If the wood had not been so dark, so alive! And for a second she had the senseless, terrifying thought of a child. What if I never get out? Then she laughed at it, and stood still again, listening. There was no sound to guide her, no sound at all except that faint, dull rumble, which seemed to come from every side now. And the trees watched her. Ugh, she thought, I hate this wood. She saw it now, its snaky branches, its darkness and great forms, as an abode of giants and witches. She groped and scrambled on again, tripped once more, and fell, hitting her forehead against a trunk. The blow dazed and sobered her. It's idiotic, she thought. I'm a baby. I'll just walk very slowly till I reach the edge. I know it isn't a large wood. She turned deliberately to face each direction, solemnly selected that from which the muttering of the guns seemed to come, and started again, moving very slowly with her hands stretched out. Something rustled in the undergrowth, quite close. She saw a pair of green eyes shining. Her heart jumped into her mouth. The thing sprang. There was a swish of ferns and twigs, and silence. Noel clasped her breast. A pouching cat. And again she moved forward, but she had lost direction. I'm going round and round, she thought. They always do. And the sinking, scattered feeling of the bush clutched at her again. Shall I call? She thought. I must be near the road, but it's so babyish. She moved on again. Her foot struck something soft. A voice muttered a thick oath. A hand seized her ankle. She leaped and dragged and wrenched it free, and utterly unnerved she screamed and ran forward blindly. End of Part 4, Chapter 4. Part 4, Chapter 5 of Saints' Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 5. No one could have so convinced a feeling as Jimmy thought that he would be a bit of a makeshift for Noel. He had spent the weeks after his interview with her father obsessed by her image, often saying to himself, "It won't do. It's playing it too low down to try and get that child, when I know that, but for her trouble, I shouldn't have a chance." He had never had much opinion of his looks, but now he seemed to himself absurdly old and dried up in this desert of a London. He loathed the office job to which they had put him, and the whole atmosphere of officialdom. Another year of it, and he would shrivel like an old apple. He began to look at himself anxiously, taking stock of his physical assets now that he had this dream of young beauty. He would be 40 next month, and she was 19. But there would be times, too, when he would feel that, with her, he could be as much of a 3-year-old as the youngster she had loved. Having little hope of winning her, he took her past but lightly. Was it not that past which gave him what chance he had? On 2 things he was determined. He would not trade on her past, and if by any chance she took him, he would never show her that he remembered that she had one. After writing to Gratian, he had spent the week before his holiday began in an attempt to renew the youthfulness of his appearance, which made him feel older, leaner, bonier, and browner than ever. He got up early, rode in the rain, took Turkish baths, and did all manner of exercises, neither smoked nor drank, and went to bed early, exactly as if he had been going to ride a steeplechase. On the afternoon when at last he left on that terrific pilgrimage, he gazed at his face with a sort of despair. It was so lean and leather-coloured, and he counted almost a dozen grey hairs. When he reached the bungalow and was told that she was working in the cornfields, he had for the first time a feeling that fate was on his side. Such a meeting would be easier than any other. He had been watching her for several minutes before she saw him, with his heart beating more violently than it had ever beaten in the trenches, and that new feeling of hope stayed with him, all through the greeting, throughout supper, and even after he had left them and gone upstairs. Then, with the suddenness of a blind drawn down, it vanished, and he sat on, trying to talk, and slowly getting more and more silent and restless. "Molly gets so tired working," Gratian said. He knew she meant it kindly, but that she should say it at all was ominous. He got up at last, having lost hope of seeing Noel again, conscious too that he had answered the last 3 questions at random. In the porch, George said, "You'll come into lunch tomorrow, won't you?" "Oh, thanks. I'm afraid it'll bore you all." "Not a bit. Molly won't be so tired." Again, so well meant. They were very kind. He looked up from the gate, trying to make out which her window might be, but all was dark. A little way down the road he stopped to light a cigarette, and leaning against a gate drew the smoke of it deep into his lungs, trying to assuage the ache in his heart. So it was hopeless. She had taken the very first chance to get away from him. She knew that he loved her, could not help knowing, for he had never been able to keep it out of his eyes and voice. If she had felt ever so little for him, she would not have avoided him this first evening. "I'll go back to that desert," he thought. "I'm not going to whine and crawl. I'll go back and bite on it. One must have some pride. Oh, why the hell am I crocked up like this? If only I could get out to France again." And then Noel's figure bent over the falling corn formed before him. "I'll have one more try," he thought. "One more. Tomorrow somewhere. I'll get to know for certain. And if I get what Lila's got, I shall deserve it, I suppose. Poor Lila. Where is she? Back at High Constantia?" What was that? A cry of terror in that wood. Crossing to the edge, he called, "Cooey!" and stood peering into its darkness. He heard the sound of bushes being brushed aside, and whistled. A figure came bursting out almost into his arms. "Hello," he said. "What's up?" A voice gasped. "Oh, it's nothing." He saw Noel. She had swayed back and stood about a yard away. He could dimly see her covering her face with her arms. Feeling instinctively that she wanted to hide her fright, he said quietly, "What luck! I was just passing. It's awfully dark." I got lost, and a man caught my foot in there." Moved beyond control by the little gulps and gasps of her breathing, he stepped forward and put his hands on her shoulders. He held her lightly, without speaking, terrified lest he should wound her pride. "I got in there," she gasped, "and the trees, and I stumbled over a roan asleep, and he—" Yes, I know," he murmured, as if to a child. She had dropped her arms now, and he could see her face, with eyes unnaturally dilated and lips quivering. Then, moved again beyond control, he drew her so close that he could feel the throbbing of her heart, and put his lips to her forehead, all wet with heat. She closed her eyes, gave a little choke, and buried her face against his coat. There, my darling," he kept on saying,
There, there, my darling.
He could feel the snuggling of her cheek against his shoulder. He had got her. He was somehow certain that she would not draw back now. And in the wonder and ecstasy of that thought, all the world above her head, the stars in their courses, the wood which had frightened her, seemed miracles of beauty and fitness. But such fortune had never come to man. He had got her. And he murmured over and over again, "I love you." She was resting perfectly quiet against him, while her heart ceased gradually to beat so fast. He could feel her cheek rubbing against his coat of Harry's tweed. Suddenly she sniffed at it and whispered, "It smells good."
End of Part 4, Chapter 5. Part 4, Chapter 6 of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 6. When summer sun has burned all Egypt, the white man looks eagerly each day for evening, whose rose-coloured veil melts opalescent into the dun drift of the hills, and iridescent above into the slowly deepening blue. Pierson stood gazing at the mystery of the desert from under the little group of palms and bougainvillea which formed the garden of the hospital. Evensong was in full voice. From the far wing a gramophone was grinding out a music-hall ditty. 2 aeroplanes, wheeling exactly like the buzzards of the desert, were letting drip the faint whir of their flight. Metallic voices drifted from the Arab village. The wheels of the water-wells creaked, and every now and then a dry rustle was stirred from the palm leaves by puffs of desert wind. On either hand an old road ran out, whose line could be marked by the little old watchtowers of another age. For how many 100 years had human life passed along it to east and west, the brown men and their camels threading that immemorial track over the desert, which ever filled him with wonder, so still it was, so wide, so desolate, and every evening so beautiful. He sometimes felt that he could sit forever looking at it, as though its cruel, mysterious loveliness were home, and yet he never looked at it without a spasm of homesickness. So far his new work had brought him no nearer to the hearts of men, or at least he did not feel it had. Both at the regimental base and now in this hospital, an intermediate stage, waiting for the draft with which he would be going into Palestine, all had been very nice to him, friendly, and as it were indulgent, as might schoolboys have treated some well-intentioned, dreamy master, or businessmen, a harmless, idealistic inventor, who came visiting their offices. He had even the feeling that they were glad to have him about, just as they were glad to have their mascots and their regimental colours. But of heart-to-heart simple comradeship, it seemed they neither wanted it of him nor expected him to give it, so that he had a feeling that he would be forward and impertinent to offer it. Moreover, he no longer knew how. He was very lonely. When I come face to face with death, he would think, it will be different. Death makes us all brothers. I may be of real use to them then. They brought him a letter while he stood there, listening to that evensong, gazing at the old desert road. "Darling Dad, I do hope this will reach you before you move on to Palestine. You said in your last, at the end of September, so I hope you'll just get it. There is one great piece of news which I'm afraid will hurt and trouble you. Nolly is married to Jimmy Fort. They were married down here this afternoon and have just gone up to town. They have to find a house, of course. She's been very restless, lonely, and unhappy ever since you went, and I'm sure it is really for the best. She's quite another creature, and simply devoted, headlong. It's just like Nolly. She says she didn't know what she wanted up to the last minute. But now she seems as if she could never want anything else. Dad, dear, Nolly could never have made good by herself. It isn't her nature, and it's much better like this, I feel sure, and so does George. Of course it isn't ideal, and one wanted that for her, but she did break her wing, and he is so awfully good and devoted to her, though you didn't believe it, and perhaps won't even now. The great thing is to feel her happy again, and know she's safe. Nolly is capable of great devotion, only she must be anchored. She was drifting all about, and one doesn't know what she might have done in one of her moods. I do hope you won't grieve about it. She's dreadfully anxious about how you'll feel.
I know it will be wretched for you, so far off, but do try and believe it's for the best. She's out of danger, and she was really in a horrible position. It's so good for the baby, too, and only fair to him. I do think one must take things as they are, Daddy dear. It was impossible to mend Nolly's wing if she were a fighter and gloried in it, or if she were the sort who would take the veil, but she isn't either. So it's all right, Dad. She's writing to you herself. I'm sure Lila didn't want Jimmy Forts to be unhappy because he couldn't love her, or she would never have gone away. George sends you his love. We are both very well, and Nolly is looking splendid still after her harvest work. All my love, Dad dear. Is there anything we can get and send you? Do take care of your blessed self, and don't grieve about Nolly. Gratian. A half sheet of paper fluttered down. He picked it up from among the parched fibre of dead palm leaves. Daddy, darling, I've done it. Forgive me. I'm so happy. Your Nolly. The desert shimmered, the palm leaves rustled, and Pierson stood trying to master the emotion roused in him by these 2 letters. He felt no anger, not even vexation. He felt no sorrow, but a loneliness so utter and complete that he did not know how to bear it. It seemed as if some last link with life had snapped. My girls are happy, he thought. If I am not, what does it matter? If my faith and my convictions mean nothing to them, why should they follow? I must and will not feel lonely. I ought to have the sense of God present, to feel his hand in mine. If I cannot, what use am I? What use to the poor fellows in there? What use in all the world? An old native on a donkey went by, piping a Sudanese melody on a little wooden Arab flute. Pierson turned back into the hospital, humming it. A nurse met him there. The poor boy at the end of A ward is sinking fast, sir. I expect he'd like to see you. He went into A ward and walked down between the beds to the west window end, where 2 screens had been put to block off the cot. Another nurse, who was sitting beside it, rose at once. He's quite conscious, she whispered. He can still speak a little. He's such a dear. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she passed out behind the screens. Pierson looked down at the boy. Perhaps he was 20, but the unshaven down on his cheeks was soft and almost colourless. His eyes were closed. He breathed regularly, and did not seem in pain, but there was about him that which told he was going, something resigned, already of the grave. The window was wide open, covered by mosquito netting, and a tiny line of sunlight, slanting through across the foot of the cot, crept slowly backwards over the sheets and the boy's body, shortening as it crept. In the grey whiteness of the walls, the bed, the boy's face, just that pale yellow bar of sunlight, and one splash of red and blue from a little flag on the wall, glowed out. At this cooler hour, the ward behind the screens was almost empty, and few sounds broke the stillness. But from without came that intermittent rustle of dry palm leaves. Pierson waited in silence, watching the sun sink. If the boy might pass like this, it would be God's mercy. Then he saw the boy's eyes open, wonderfully clear eyes of the lighted grey which has dark rims. His lips moved, and Pierson bent down to hear. "I'm going west, sir." The whisper had a little soft burr. The lips quivered, a pucker as of a child formed on his face, and passed. Through Pierson's mind there flashed the thought, "O God, let me be some help to him." "To God, my dear son," he said. A flicker of humour, of ironic question passed over the boy's lips. Terribly moved, Pierson knelt down and began softly, fervently, praying. His whispering mingled with the rustle of the palm leaves, while the bar of sunlight crept up the body. In the boy's smile had been the whole of stoic doubt, of stoic acquiescence. It had met him with an unconscious challenge, had seemed to know so much. Pierson took his hand, which lay outside the sheet. The boy's lips moved as though in thanks. He drew a long, feeble breath, as if to suck in the thread of sunlight, and his eyes closed. Pierson bent over the hand. When he looked up, the boy was dead. He kissed his forehead, and went quietly out. The sun had set, and he walked away from the hospital to a hillock beyond the track on the desert's edge, and stood looking at the afterglow. The sun and the boy, together they had gone west into that wide, glowing nothingness. The muezzin call to sunset prayer in the Arab village came to him clear and sharp, while he sat there, unutterably lonely. Why had that smile so moved him? Other death smiles had been like this evening smile on the desert hills, a glowing peace, a promise of heaven. But the boy's smile had said, "Waste no breath on me. You cannot help. Who knows? I have no hope, no faith, but I am adventuring. Goodbye." Poor boy! He had braved all things, and moved out uncertain, yet undaunted. Was that, then, the uttermost truth? Was faith a smaller thing? But from that strange notion he recoiled with horror. In faith I have lived, in faith I will die, he thought, God helping me. And the breeze, ruffling the desert sand, blew the grains against the palms of his hands, outstretched above the warm earth. End of Part 4, Chapter 6. End of Saint's Progress by John Galsworthy.